Hello and welcome to Atop the Fourth Wall, where bad comics burn. But more importantly, welcome to Event Comics Month 3, Crisis of the Secret House! And wow, while the last two Event Comics months, you guys wanted to see a much more diverse range of events, classic ones, modern ones, in between, this time around, you guys favored the modern. Seriously, I expected Infinity Crusade in there just to round out the trilogy, but I guess with no Avengers movie on the horizon, that's out. Not for lack of trying, mind you. Infinity Crusade, Secret Wars 2, and even Armageddon 2001 got a good chunk of votes, but you guys had other ones you really wanted to see. However, we do have one event comic that's over 2 decades old to talk about today, namely the original sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths, 0 Hour, Crisis in Time. DC has always had a very complicated relationship with Crisis on Infinite Earths. Its original purpose of streamlining the DC universe, while ambitious and mostly successful, has not been done without hiccups and bits of disorganization because of one hand not knowing what the other is doing. In turn, you've got different writers who want to reintroduce aspects of the old canon back into the new canon, and consequently overcomplicating things again, with various writers and editors not being able to agree on the best approach to doing that. And thus, that's why it feels like every 10 years DC tries to do it over. For the 10th anniversary, it was 0 Hour, for the 20th, Infinite Crisis, and for the 30th, Convergence. Just saying, don't be surprised if the DC universe gets rebooted again in 2025. Now, I say that 0 Hour was a sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths, but it's only really so in a spiritual sense. They do make references here or there to the original Crisis, but for the most part it's about the state of DC Comics in the mid-90s. During this time, the greater DC universe was not aware of the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths beyond they fought some creature called the Anti-Monitor. They didn't remember the multiverse or alternate versions of characters, and in particular, they wanted to address a lot of the continuity issues that arose post-Crisis, like different alternate futures, the Legion of Superheroes not having Superboy as part of their history anymore, despite being integral to a lot of their stories, Superman not being a founding member of the League, that sort of thing. So the end goal, like Crisis on Infinite Earths, was to streamline the DC Universe timeline, put out a more exact map of when events occurred in the past, with stuff like Superman's first appearance being a nebulous 10 years ago, and what are the events that happen in the far future. Did they succeed? But let's not worry about that right now, and instead look at the event itself and whether or not it's a good story on its own. Let's dig into 0 Hour, Crisis in Time.
Welcome to Atop the Fourth Wall, where bad comics burn. Linkara's gonna teach you all a lesson you won't learn. Brodsky, you're not the smartest. Life out, you're not an artist. Anyone who's had a bad comic published, it could be your turn. Linkara, he's a man punch, wears a birdie hat. Linkara, he has a magic gun. Where'd he purchase that? Linkara, coins, robots, Amazon and trucks. Linkara, this comic sucks. Linkara.
While we're not going to look at the covers in depth, I should note that 0 Hours had a couple gimmicks to them. For starters, since the book is called 0 Hour, the book's order is actually in reverse. We start with issue number 4 and end on number 0. In addition, much like how Final Crisis's covers tried to have everything deteriorate as the series went on to indicate the multiverse collapsing, this one has a white ball of entropy start in the center and slowly engulf the cover until issue 0's is just all white. There was also a holofoil component to the title in spots, but nothing too significant or anything like in other 90s covers. The trade for 0 Hour actually includes a 2-part story that gives a little backstory leading directly into Zero Hour, originally printed in Showcase 94, number 8 and 9, but with Event Comics Month, we focus on only the event's main miniseries. Besides, I'm about to give you all the backstory here, so let's just get into it. This is stuff we've covered before, but in case you're new around here, the two main points we've got to cover are the characters Monarch and Parallax. Monarch is the villain from the previously mentioned Armageddon 2001 event. We've brought him up a few times, mostly in relation to Countdown, but both that and Battle for Bloodhaven were a while ago, so here's a quick primer. It's actually fitting that he's here, considering the time shenanigans from that storyline. So who is he? Well, due to said time shenanigans and the murder of Dawn Granger, aka Dove, Hank Hall, aka Hawk, went insane and became Monarch and intended to take over the world, of course, but was foiled in that attempt. In those Showcase 94 issues I mentioned, Monarch ended up changing his look and codename to Extant because, I don't know, he says he was actually a fusing of Hawk and Dove? Which only really explains why his cape is purple. Doesn't really explain why he changed his name to something meaning still in existence or surviving. I mean, it makes sense in this story, but I don't think Monarch was like, oh cool, my name is really meta for the readers. And then there's Parallax, aka Hal Jordan. As a refresher there, during the death and resurrection of Superman, Hal Jordan's hometown of Coast City was destroyed. Being driven insane by the loss, he went on to murder the Guardians of the Universe, several Green Lanterns, and just outright destroyed the Green Lantern Corps in general. And for some reason, like Monarch changing his name to Extant, Hal decided to rename himself after an optical effect whereby an object's distance or position can look different depending on where it's viewed from. Because when you just murdered a bunch of your best friends with the intent of stealing power, what's really important is a metaphor about your perspective on the situation. It's like if he shouted at Green Arrow, "From my point of view, the Guardians of the Universe are evil!" That, of course, got retconned later to him actually being possessed by an evil space bug made out of living fear, because comic books. But that's like a decade away from this story. We open in Earth's distant future. 32 hours ago, the end of time. What time is it? The end of time basically means something hit the negative color function on the universe, since now the stars are all black and space is white. Someone is attacking the Time Trapper, a Legion of Superheroes villain who's kind of emblematic of why Zero Hour exists at all. You see, he's some kind of being who exists at the end of time and creates a pocket universe resembling the original Earth 1 pre-crisis as part of an elaborate scheme to fight the Legion, and eventually killed the version of Superboy in that pocket, and wow, I have suddenly convinced myself that reboots are a great idea. Anyway, point is that the Time Trapper is a bit of a big deal, and he gets his ass kicked, pretty much vaporized by a hidden foe. Interesting place, the end of time. Entropy crushes all energy, all life. From here, you can look back on all that is and all that was, and change it. Plus, it's a lakefront property. Easy to do, if you know how. The cosmos is in agony. It stepped on a Lego. And I'm the only one who knows how it should be. Given the silhouette, the cape, the talk of entropy, and the knowing how it should be thing, I wonder if they were originally trying to make people think the Monitor was behind all this. The countdown has begun. The countdown to Zero Hour. What is Zero Hour? I don't know, I'm really only saying it for dramatic effect. It has no bearing on the plot. There's a weird one-page diversion to Darkseid on Apocalypse. Metron shows up seeking aid because time is apparently beginning to unravel. Impossible. I would be aware of such an occurrence. Dude, you spend 90% of your day sitting on couches. You miss stuff all the time. Metron says he has no time to argue and must find allies. And that's it. Metron shows up again later, but Darkseid doesn't. Feels like he's only here to acknowledge his existence and then move on. We cut to Gotham City 69 hours ago. Okay, now we know what time it is. Nice time. The Joker is being pursued by Batgirl. As in Barbara Gordon Batgirl. Except as both Batman and the Tim Drake Robin point out as they arrive, she was shot and paralyzed 5 years ago. Not me. I've never been shot. By the way, who's your new partner? He seems younger than the Robin I remember.
I'd love to stay and continue this reunion, but you obviously have things to discuss that don't include me. And I'll just pretend that I didn't overhear you call her Barbara or that she was shot 5 years ago like I did Barbara Gordon. Bye!
The Joker uses a flash grenade to escape to a helicopter that was conveniently overhead. In the meantime, they wonder about Batgirl's presence, especially since she seems younger than their Barbara anyway. And overhead, Dick Grayson as Robin watches all this and waits for his chance to be in a tie-in to the event. Yeah, that's basically how the tie-ins to the event worked. We'd have old versions of characters interacting with newer ones, like, say, a younger Dick Grayson alongside Tim Drake. Or we'd explore alternate possibilities and heroes. For instance, a character named Triumph appeared who claimed to be a founding member of the Justice League, taking Superman's place in the history. Or there's an alternate timeline where Jor-El was wrong about Krypton's destruction, and thus the planet lived. It makes for some intriguing possibilities for stories, and I really appreciate that about any event that can allow you to tell stories you normally can't in the regular run. Just a pity that it requires the space-time continuum to start having a stroke in order for it to happen. Speaking of, we cut to Vanishing Point, a subdimension normally outside the space-time continuum. Kind of a stable area existing right before the universe completely succumbs to entropy. The base at Vanishing Point is occupied by a group called the Linear Men, scientists and superpowered beings who monitor the time stream and try to keep the timeline focused and unaltered. Among their members are Wave Rider, a superhero who spun out of the previously mentioned Armageddon 2001, and Rip Hunter, time travel extraordinaire, who during this point in the DC Universe was really trying his best to make everyone think he was Cable. Their equipment has discovered something bad. History is being erased in a very roundabout fashion. It's being destroyed backwards. A wave of entropy, not unlike the antimatter one from Crisis on Infinite Earths, is somehow going backwards through time and erasing everything. It's a very interesting concept, but I don't think the book really executes it that well. We perceive time as moving from cause to effect, from the past to the future. So it's really hard to portray something like that moving backwards through time, as we'll see. For instance, Wave Rider and Hunter arrive in the 64th century and meet Wally West, who was there for a time. The entropy wave is moving through time and space, but if it's going from the future to the past, how can anyone be perceiving it in the present? Because each second that passes moves us further into the future, but that future no longer exists, but we didn't see it in the past, even though it's moving towards the past and—
Oh no, I've gone cross-eyed.
Yeah, you see the problem with trying to portray this. Anyway, it's suggested that maybe Wally, as the Flash, can cause some kind of whiplash effect to close the vortex, as they call it, but he fails, disappearing just like Barry did when he destroyed the antimatter cannon. Don't worry, kids, he ended up fine. We've got a few weeks before we really see them screw with Wally West. But hey, at least Wave Rider's got himself a cool Flash cosplay now. Why did his costume stay? Come to think of it, why did Barry's costume stay? 64th century is gone, back to the present day, where Superman and Batman are meeting up outside Metropolis and compare notes about how sucky things have been in their respective books. A storyline called Fall of Metropolis, or Bane breaking Batman's back and all that. It's been quite a year for both of us. For instance, I grew a mullet.
Something very strange is happening in Gotham. People from the past are appearing, and yet none of them are bringing Betamax tapes with them. They all still insist on using VHS.
Metron shows up, saying that a cosmic crisis has begun, and they need to act quickly to save the universe. We cut to 5700 AD, where Wave Rider and Rip Hunter have once again caught up with the entropy wave and encounter another modern-day hero. Or rather, a past version of one. Hal Jordan before everything went down. Apparently Hal was summoned into the future to try to fight the wave, but he's no good. Amusingly, the guy who pulled him into the future is this Colonel Sanders-looking dude named Paul Manning, who is also Hal Jordan. Kinda, sorta. It's not important. I'd never even heard of this guy before Zero Hour, and he apparently got erased from continuity post-Zero Hour and has never made a return. I just find that greatly amusing. Rip Hunter realizes that something about all this is familiar and instructs Wave Rider to return to Vanishing Point and look up a crisis right before both he and the younger Hal Jordan are erased by the field. Wave Rider narrowly escapes himself. Once again, a universal existence dies. A future that will never be. Hundreds of millions of lives now unborn. Stock prices in greeting card companies drop exponentially. Back in the present, Hawkman is beating up Vandal Savage. Until he suddenly splits into like 6 different versions of himself. Okay, quick explanation here. Hawkman was one of the continuity hiccups post-Crisis that never got properly resolved. Somehow he was on both the Justice Society in the 40s and the Justice League in the modern day without explanation. And then they tried to retcon his backstory completely in a miniseries that only made things more confusing. Zero Hour attempted to fix him, but you know how sometimes you fix something so much you break it? After we get a brief check-in with a lesser-known mystical hero named Dr. Mist, Kyle Rayner is summoned to Metron and Superman. Bear in mind that this was only a few months into the character's introduction, and continuity-wise, according to his thought clouds, his girlfriend had just been stuffed in a fridge, so this was one of the first things that could potentially hype the character a bit. And instead, he's just kind of wasted. Anyway, they need his help because the Green Lantern ring, combined with Metron's Mobius chair, will allow Superman to contact pretty much everybody in the DC universe to inform them of what's going on and ask for assistance. It might have helped if he had, told people where they were supposed to meet up. With that done, Metron tries to recruit the Spectre to join in the fight.
Natural disasters do not concern me. My mission is directed only against evil.
Oh, sure, I mean, a wave of entropy eating its way backwards through time, that's the cosmic equivalent of a light drizzle. At Vanishing Point, Wave Rider searches the records of the Linear Men and learns about the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, much to his shock and amazement. I think this page is kind of a good example of how this event feels rushed. Dan Jurgens does a fine job writing and drawing this, but compared to other events we've covered in the last few years, the artwork feels very restrained and laid back. It's not bad, but events usually seem to be the chance to bring a real spectacle to the art, show off tons and tons of heroes interacting. Even Flashpoint, while basically being just a Flash story, tried to convey the scope and size of the events happening during the event and how big it was. And thus here we have this moment where a character learns of Crisis on Infinite Earths after a decade of almost no one in universe remembering it, and there's no, splash page or 2-page spread depicting the events? No big dramatic reveal paying homage to the iconic moments of the Crisis or the things that happened? Sure, it's still fine. It gets the information out that needs to be gotten out, but it doesn't carry the grandeur that something like this should be carrying, and I know that Jurgens is capable of delivering on that. Well, I suppose there's nothing that could be done about that. I mean, what would this book have been if we hadn't checked in on Dr. Mist, am I right? The Justice Society meets up, with some weirdness happening with Alan Scott. He's young again, his costume looks not terrible, but the attempt to modernize it feels wrong somehow. Wave Rider arrives, having brought Wally's costume to Jay Garrick because he felt obligated to tell him? Again, it feels rushed. Wave Rider has no particular reason to go to the JSA to tell them about what happened. Oh, but this bad day keeps getting worse, because Extant now stands revealed as a villain in this, and owing once again to the rushed nature, his reveal is just in the corner of the page for the end of the first issue. And he has arrived at Vanishing Point. Hawkman explains to the others that while Superman wants all the heroes to gather in New York, they'll have Dr. Fate deliver the JSA directly to the source of all these time shenanigans to investigate. The younger heroes can protect the planet. With Wave Rider, we can investigate the source. Our experience with time gives us the edge in this fight. Experience or not, 3/4 of this group only have the superpower of punching people really, really hard. I think you might need a more diverse set of powers to deal with something that is erasing most of existence. Dr. Fate starts teleporting them to Vanishing Point, but Wave Rider, Hawkman, and Hawkwoman somehow end up teleporting elsewhere. After some minor character development with Superman relating to his tie-in issues, a run-in with Impulse, and a weird cutaway to the Time Trapper fighting Cosmic Boy of the Legion of Superheroes, revealing that the Trapper is actually a future version of Cosmic Boy at that. Your guess is as good as mine. It has nothing to do with the main story. All the heroes that Superman called for arrive in New York, including a very pregnant Power Girl storyline happening in Justice League stuff at the time. And here we finally get a big hero shot in a 2-page spread, including the alternate Batgirl and a new hero from the Superman tie-ins named Alpha Centaurian. Also, little known fact from those who remember my Titans retrospective, apparently Panther can fly! While they get organized, the JSA arrives at Vanishing Point, but are immediately attacked by Extant.
I live outside your laws, your rules, your very notions of reality. No parking? I'll park wherever I feel like.
Wave Rider and the Hawks arrive somewhere, I have no idea, and they spot various other variations of themselves, a lot of whom actually look pretty cool to be honest, flying overhead. You Hawk beings must be one of the major chronal disruptions resulting from the first crisis, but something is pulling all your various versions back, making them converge into the entity that inspired and infused them. He is now reclaiming all he started, reveling in the instability created over the years, while worlds die in the process.
Yes, that's a real pickle.
The being that he's referring to is this weird hawk creature that's fighting the Hawkman from that miniseries I mentioned earlier. I don't know, maybe this thing appeared there first, and thus this makes more sense if I had read it, but yeah, this sequence is baffling for me. Although even if I had context for that, there is no context for what happens next. A blast of cosmic energy hits the two Hawkmen, Hawkwoman, and the Hawk creature, and merges them all into one. And suddenly Metron is here now. It is a birth. At the least, a powerful ally we will need to turn the tide in our own battle. At the most, a new god. At the center, utter bafflement. Yeah, this was DC's solution to the continuity problems of Hawkman and Hawkwoman. Literally merge them all together. How does this fix the continuity exactly? Your guess is as good as mine. Hawkman's backstory is now just, I don't know. Yeah, not sure why this doesn't create some kind of David Cronenberg-esque abomination, but whatever. This version would later die? Or be sent to limbo? I'm not sure. Either way, he was shoved aside and they simplified his origin later on as basically being about reincarnation and aliens. Until Jeff Johns brought him back with that revised origin, the character was considered radioactive by DC. Just don't bring him up, don't use him. Anyway, the heroes speculate about who among them is even real, with people like Batgirl and Alpha Centaurian saying they certainly feel real, a point we'll get to later. And Wave Rider arrives with Metron and the merged Hawkman to inform them of what's up. He doesn't go into specifics about the crisis, only that it was an event so destructive that it never fully settled. They're still experiencing the equivalent of aftershocks in time that they're only now becoming aware of. He's not sure how to stop it, even mentioning how both Hal Jordan and Wally West have died trying to stop the wave of entropy that's eating away at existence. Guy Gardner, who's among the heroes, speculates that if a younger version of Hal has been killed, then maybe that means they can alter history so Jordan never goes nuts, maybe even save Coast City and the Green Lantern Corps. Yeah, sure, Guy, this entire situation was brought about because history has been violently altered, but yeah, let's change the timeline some more. In for a penny at this point, am I right? Captain Atom and Aquaman point out that the idea that this entropy wave could be a natural phenomenon as a result of the altered timeline is, well, stupid. After all, if it's just a matter of time being altered, it'd just alter, cause and effect and all that. Someone has to actually be actively responsible for this. Wave Rider had not considered this possibility, which is an especially baffling point because why the hell would he bother to join forces with Metron to gather all these heroes if there wasn't something for them to fight? Speaking of, the fight with Extant does not go well for the JSA. I first learned about Zero Hour thanks to Comics 101, a weekly column that talks about a lot of comic history, and its writer, Scott Tipton, who was not at all kind to how this fight goes. It's the kind of thing where you have to have the villains show off how powerful they are so people recognize they're a threat, and the way they decided to do this was to have the Justice Society, the first real superhero team, gets slaughtered. The Atom is vaporized. Dr. Fate, arguably the most powerful among them, even gets blasted away with one shot. Those like Wildcat and Sandman, who had various spells and other things that kept them young despite being active in the 40s, have those reversed, so now they're 80 years old, while Hourman and Dr. Midnight are completely aged to death. I think the idea was to once again try to firmly establish the DC Universe timeline. The sliding timescale of comics means that some characters can say to have appeared a nebulous amount of time previously, but characters like the JSA were very much tied to a specific point in history, World War II, and yet age-wise looked like they were as contemporary as others. And don't get me wrong, this is a misstep. Dying in a struggle to save life is one thing, but they don't even get any hits off. This is not an epic, heroic struggle. This is just a massacre and completely one-sided. It should not have gone down like this, but I kind of get the reasoning. When you have characters tied to a specific point in history, the farther we get from that point, the more head-scratching it is that they're still around, or that there is no passage of time from that. And I love the Justice Society. They're great characters with a rich history and fascinating bad guys and an incredible legacy both for themselves and those who took on their mantles later. But 20 years from now, a century will have passed since World War II. And if they're active and looking like they haven't aged a day since then, it's gonna tilt some heads, regardless of the in-story explanations for stuff like this. This isn't helped either by some serious ageism we get later in the story, where Jay Garrick and Alan Scott basically say, "Nah, we're done being superheroes, only young people can do it." It feels like a middle finger to the characters. And in the 90s, for crying out loud, when the new generation of heroics was frickin' Youngblood.
Dude, I know you like your dinosaur characters, but this is the 90s! We need to have our heroes more realistic, with guns and pouches, and be like 90% muscle!
So I've been ignoring the so-and-so hours ago captions, but now I'm just laughing. The previous conversation between Wave Rider and the heroes was 14 hours ago. But now, after it was suggested that an evil force might be behind the entropy wave, it's 12 hours, 45 minutes ago. So I guess Wave Rider was just standing there for an hour dumbfounded by the revelation while everyone else mingled or something.